Here. I'm very excited to start this new social studies unit with you. We are going to be talking about Kansas and trails in Kansas and why they were important, challenges that pioneers faced, other people that were involved in the trails in Kansas. So we have to start with westward expansion. One of the great things about this learning opportunity is when you have a presentation like this, if you don't quite understand something, you can pause it and go back and re-listen to it again. So if you are a little bit confused, it might be a good idea to pause the video, go back and re-listen. Just like when we're reading a difficult text, we can go back and reread. Here you can go back and listen. So I would encourage you to do that anytime you're unsure of what you've heard. So let's get started with our westward expansion, a fourth grade adventure. After the lesson today, I can describe manifest destiny, and you'll be able to compare and contrast different perspectives of people alive during westward expansion. So let's get started. You're going to learn about manifest destiny and the different perspectives. So like how different people saw different things during westward expansion. So let's talk about what is westward expansion. That's when the United States right here was in the pink, and that's how much they owned. That was the country. And we know today it looks like this whole piece of the continent, but back then it was only this pink part. So then we know the Louisiana Purchase was signed in 1803, and that doubled the size of our country. So it included both the purple and the pink part. And the United States believed in manifest destiny. And what that means is they believed that it was God's plan, his power, that everyone in the United States owned from over here on the Atlantic coast, clear over all of this land over here to the Pacific coast. They called that the manifest destiny. So that was one of your questions. That's one thing you need to know after this lesson. They believed it was God's plan, that it was their right to explore this land and to own it and to take it over and to call it their own. We know that there were other people that were already living there. But at that time, the explorers and the settlers really didn't have a lot of information on that. They were just going to go forward and they were going to plant crops. And we know that the government put things in place to help encourage them to do so. So we're going to watch a quick video about manifest destiny to help you understand it a little bit more. And you can see there, fourth graders, there are lots of different names of Native American tribes because that's who lived there before settlers came.
Here's a little story I'd like to tell about the land that we love and know so well. It started small, not much to boast, just 13 colonies on the East Coast. As time went by, Europeans moved west and took native land, calling it conquest. Why they do it? It's easy to see, an idea called manifest destiny. Georgia, 1828, the Cherokee Nation was the center of debate. They did their best to assimilate, but their land was some primetime real estate. So Andrew Jackson laid the feud to rest and forced them to leave in the name of progress. Over 15,000 faced their fears and what later became known as the Trail of Tears. Alabama, and we don't stop. Mississippi, and we don't stop. Arkansas, and we don't stop. Man, there's women and children die and make us stop. Illinois, and we don't stop. Missouri, and we don't stop. Oklahoma, and we don't stop. They reached the end, but they paid a heavy cost. By 1840, we cleared the east of native peoples, may they rest in peace. With guns and steel, the whites had their way. Now they set their sights on California, See, Mexico, as we know it today, is only a piece of where it used to lay. Back in the day, it included LA, but expansionists had something to say. According to them, it was part of God's plan to spread our culture all across the land. Our democracy was simply the best, so it's only right that we take the Southwest. Others spoke up, so let's take it slow. We need to respect the rights of Mexico, but James K. Polk took the reins. War broke out and more land was gained. New Mexico, and we don't stop. Arizona, and we don't stop. Texas, and we don't stop. Man, it's destiny, it was meant to be. Colorado, and we don't stop. Nevada, and we don't stop. California, and we don't stop. We reached the Pacific, will it ever stop? Man, we came a long way since Jamestown. don't think that Pacific Ocean's gonna stop us. Alaska, don't stop. Hawaii, don't stop. Guam, don't stop. The Philippines, don't stop. American Samoa, don't stop. The Marshall Islands, don't stop. Puerto Rico, it keeps going and going and going. Don't stop, 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 stop.
So fourth graders, as you can see, there were already people living there, and the Native Americans, or another word for Native American people, are indigenous people. They would push them to other lands so the settlers could have their land. This yellow part was where Mexico was living, people from Mexico. This was part of Mexico, and they would push them, and we'll talk more about that as we continue to learn today. One thing I did want to show you is a famous painting of Manifest Destiny. This was painted by John Gast in 1872, and this is called American Progress, which I think is a little bit a little bit ironic, because a lot of people didn't see it as progress. They saw it as Americans taking land that didn't belong to them. But in the settlers' minds, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. They were doing what their government told them to do. So it's a very famous painting that represents Manifest Destiny. Let's keep learning. So who did Westward Expansion affect? Let's first talk about the Native American people, or also known as the indigenous people. You will hear me refer to them as both. So they were pushed off their land by white settlers. When white settlers would come, they had guns and other things that they could force Native American tribes off of their land with. And you saw in that last video, they moved them to certain areas. And without going into too much detail, they would push them. There's actually a trail called the Trail of Tears, where it was a path that Native Americans traveled down to Oklahoma, or over to Oklahoma from the east side. And that's kind of where the government said they could live. And they said they could live there because the land was not great to farm, and the settlers wanted the good farmland for themselves. So natural resources were wasted and not respected. Before the settlers came, the Native Americans used every piece of the land, and they respected the land. That's very important to their culture. And the way they viewed the settlers' interactions with the land and the resources there was not respectful. So that was a point of tension between the settlers and the indigenous people. Because of this, there were some battles that occurred between the Native Americans and the settlers. Not all. Sometimes the settlers and the Native Americans got along really well. You'll see here this last bullet point, they developed relationships and they started to trade. So the settlers would trade guns for things that the Native Americans could offer them, food or clothing, or teaching them things. Horses were also another thing that were traded back and forth. But one thing that was really detrimental or bad for the indigenous people population is the settlers also brought new germs that caused great illness to the Native Americans. So the settlers had new germs and diseases that the Native Americans weren't used to, and it ended up killing thousands of them. So that's one way westward expansion affected the indigenous or the Native American people. It affected them. Their resources were not respected and wasted. They were pushed off their lands. There were some battles. The germs and illness caused many of them to die, but they also did develop some trade relationships with the settlers. So just some ways that affected them. The next slide we're going to look at is Mexico and how the westward expansion affected them. So as I mentioned before, right now our country stops right here where my mouse is going. So all of this green area up here used to be Mexico, but as settlers came into this territory, they started to become the majority, meaning there were less Mexicans up here and more European white settlers. So when that happened, they stopped following the Mexican laws. Originally, they had agreed with Mexico that when they came to this land, they would become Catholics, and they did not follow through with that. They also said that they would follow all the Mexican laws, and they didn't follow through with that either. So they started claiming the settlers came over here because their government told them to, and they started claiming all this land. And what happened was Mexico was like, no, this is our land. And the settlers were like, well, our government said we could have it. And a huge battle broke out. It was called the Mexican-American War, and it lasted for 2 years. It started in 1846, and it lasted in 1848. And the United States did end up winning that, and Mexico lost their land. So now the border that we go is right about here. You can see that. So we had the indigenous people who were pushed off their land and their resources were taken. They were ended up killed because of that. We have Mexican people who were pushed off their land and some of their things and their traditions were taken from them also. Let's talk about something that we might be more familiar with, which are the American pioneers. These were the people that the government, the United States government said, go find land, go find land. They didn't know much about the land they were exploring. Some were not prepared and many died along the way to find this land. There's many different reasons that they use for exploring. We're going to watch another video about the pioneers during that time.
Pioneers moved west for a variety of reasons. Some in search of riches, others simply to escape poverty. Some were fleeing the law, others were fleeing oppression. What they all shared was the ability to dream of something different, something better. And the West represented an opportunity for that dream to become a reality.
These were people that packed everything they had into the back of a wagon and went. And they went on faith and in themselves, in their God, in their new country. And they just went out knowing that they could do this.
Well, I think they went west for so many different reasons. But certainly among them would be the belief that you were going to not only have this new life, which you were freer, but you were going to change yourself. You were going to be a new person in the new world. And this dream that you were going to be transformed may have been just a dream, but it certainly motivated a lot of people. And every time they moved west, they were moving to the future and into a new time and leaving the old time behind.
It must have taken an enormous amount of courage, although probably some of them felt that they didn't have anything and so there was nothing to lose as they moved west. And it speaks to the human capacity to take risk and to go forward and to build in spite of all sorts of terrors, real and imagined.
Cautiously, I slipped from under the buffalo hide, got up on my knees and peered over the side of the wagon. There was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. I had the feeling that the world was left behind, and we had got over the edge of it, and were outside man's jurisdiction. Willa Cather.
So as you can see, there were lots of different reasons that people traveled westward, not just because their government told them to, but they saw this as an opportunity for themselves and their family to start a new, fresh start. Maybe they were coming from a place where they didn't have much land or much power, and moving somewhere where people hadn't explored, where there weren't huge populations, gave them freedom to start something new. So that was one reason that the pioneers started to move westward, because they had the chance to get that free land and start something new for their families. So your task today is to think about these questions that I have listed, and you're going to compare and contrast the Native Americans, the Mexicans, and the American pioneers. So I'm going to read this aloud to you. It says, compare the perspectives of people during the Westward Expansion. Use the graphic organizer and compare and contrast the perspectives of different groups of people during Westward Expansion. Think of the following questions. So these are questions that can help you fill in your graphic organizer. How did they feel about the expansion and why? So think about how each group felt about the expansion, about people moving into the land, about them moving into the land. What happened to their homes with Westward Expansion? What happened to the food sources? We kind of talked briefly about how Native Americans, they used all of the buffalo, and when more people came to use the buffalo or they started building railroads, the buffalo weren't there as much. Also thinking about the travelers, I didn't mention this yet, you'll learn this later this week, but the travelers didn't have a lot of food they could pack in their wagons. So before, when they lived out east, they might have had farms or stores they could visit, but now they don't. Number 4 says, what were some challenges they faced? And number 5 says, what are some adaptations they had to make in order to be successful? So I'm going to show you real quick what your diagram will look like. In these corners, you'll list the things that are different from the other groups. In the middle, you'll list something they all have in common. You may just have 1 or 2 things here, but you should be able to get several in the corners of each of the Native American, the Mexican, and the pioneers. So now that we have gone through this entire presentation, you should be able to describe the manifest destiny and compare and contrast different perspectives of people alive during westward expansion. I hope you enjoyed this introductory lesson. I cannot wait to teach you more about trails and the expansion westward into the United States. Have a great day, fourth graders. Thank you.